This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, so we're going to be talking today about rethinking survivor leadership. And this is a training that was developed by me, Chris Ash, and Leela Chappelle on behalf of the National Survivor Network and CAST. That's meant to kind of get us questioning and rethinking some of our fundamental assumptions about survivor leadership. We do have a longer version of this training that's interactive, breakout groups, activities, discussions. But this is just the highlights from that to get you thinking through the concepts. And if you'd like to have this training delivered in an interactive and engaging way for your organization, reach out to Survivor Leadership at castla.org. So we sometimes start by just asking ourselves, what does a survivor leader do? When we deliver this in person, we ask people, what does a survivor leader do? And give them time to share. And depending on the audience I'm presenting to, sometimes they say things like share their story, provide inspiration and hope. We ask some of the things like, what might a survivor leader need to be successful? And a lot of times those things are focused on the answers that they said to what a survivor leader does. But what usually happens in delivering this in person is people start to realize that they kind of have a very specific understanding of what survivor leadership means, right? They tend to think of survivor leadership as being limited to a certain number and kind of roles. We want to pull back, though. Let's kind of like zoom out with our lens and think about, what does leadership mean? What does leadership even mean in the first place? And so I just want to encourage you to take a moment and think of some of the great leaders you know. Who's someone you know, not just in the trafficking movement, but any leader. Think of a leader who's a really wonderful leader, and what do they do? What are the things that they do that make them a great leader, and how do they do it? A lot of times that how is things like, what traits do they have? How do they engage people? How do they supervise and lead and mentor? How do they treat others, including the people they're leading? So how do they treat colleagues, but also how do they treat people who are earlier in their career or perhaps need support and help? Why do people look to them for leadership? And if you're watching the recording of this, I want to encourage you to maybe pause and reflect on some of these questions, journal a little bit. This then leads us into thinking about, what does movement leadership mean? If we're talking about any movement, but particularly for this purpose, the anti-trafficking movement, what do we think of when we think of who we consider to be the movement leaders? Who are the leaders in the anti-trafficking movement today, steering the movement, shaping it, making decisions? Is there a single job description for movement leader? Obviously, the answer is no. There's not one job description. There's many different job descriptions for movement leaders. And similarly, if we think about the required skills and experiences and responsibilities for a movement leader, we can think of some basic skills around like communication. In terms of responsibilities, we think of decision making, but there's not really going to be one job description for a movement leader, because being a movement leader is not just one job. It can be in one of any number of jobs. This is when we always come back and think, so what do you think of when you think of survivor leader? When we talked about that earlier, we start to realize that when we think of survivor leader, a lot of times we're thinking of different skills, different jobs, different responsibilities than what we think of when we think of movement leader. Because when we get down to it, sometimes when we think of survivor leadership, we have a very specific thing in mind, right? When we think about survivor leadership, sometimes we think of someone performing the role of survivor leader, and I'll sometimes jokingly refer to this as survivor leader TM and add the little trademark sign to the end. Instead of thinking about movement leadership by people who have lived experience. We don't want to see a movement that has a specific number of opportunities available for survivor leaders, TM. That's kind of scarcity thinking. We want to think about, what if every movement leadership role in the entire sector was open and available for someone with lived experience to fill? What if we have that kind of a broad understanding of what movement leadership by people who have lived experience means? So to kind of get into where we came from these assumptions about survivor leadership and what it is, we kind of want to pull back and think about tokenizing and the spectrum of survivor engagement. So years ago, I was working at the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and I had to write a manual called Expanding Our Reach. It is for rape crisis centers to better serve and support survivors of trafficking. And I got to thinking as I was writing that, how do we talk to these rape crisis centers about how to have survivor-informed services that are shaped by the experiences and knowledge and insight of people with lived experience? And I ended up finding the spectrum of public participation. And that's by the International Association for Public Participation. And it was meant to think about how, when you're doing decision-making for a community, communities may have different levels of engagement and impact on the decisions that are made. And so I'm like, aha, we can adapt this for survivor leadership, because sometimes we think of survivor leadership and survivor informed as an on-off switch. Is it survivor informed? Is it not? And if it's survivor informed in any way, whether that's a meaningful way or not, then you find some of these organizations saying it's survivor informed, right? But that gets us stuck in binaries. We start thinking either it's survivor led or it's not, or it's survivor led or it's bad, or survivor led is better, but survivor led programming is less professional, or if it's not survivor led, it's paternalistic or savory. And we get stuck into this back and forth and back and forth. And what we really need is something a little more complex, because survivor is not a job description or a skill set. I've actually had people write to me and ask if I can provide them with a sample job description for a survivor leader. And the answer is no, because that's not a job. The job is what you want that survivor to do as a leader. What is the job you want them to do, the work you want them to do? And then you write the description, the job description for the role you want them to play that you're hiring for. And because survivor is not a job description or skill set, sometimes you may have someone come in who's brilliant and has lots of insights and wisdom and experience, but may still need a little bit of training and support and professional development and coaching to achieve their goals as professionals. When we think about getting out of this binary, we have to kind of face some hard truths about some practices that have been pretty normalized in the anti-trafficking sector. The first one is asking impacted and marginalizations to lead or create a project they aren't equipped for in the name of equity, and then watching them fail is violence. That is not a fair thing to do to people, to dump tasks on them so you can wave your DEI flag and then not do the work to ensure that their work is supported. Asking impacted and marginalized populations to lead, and then giving them a script or doing the work yourself while letting them be the public face of your work is gross, right? That's not survivor leadership. That's survivor parading, right? It's not okay. Neither of these are genuinely going to foster survivor leadership. So I came back and adapted the spectrum of public participation into a spectrum of survivor engagement. And again, this was introduced in Expanding Our Reach. It was first published in 2019. But inform means you keep survivors informed about decisions that impact them. And that might look like, are your fact sheets in plain language? Is your website accessible? Does your website use a whole lot of jargon? Can inform might also mean, do your clients know how to file a grievance? These are all things that are important pieces of inform. Consult might be seeking out and reviewing survivor feedback and incorporate it when possible. That might be things like, do you actually do surveys with your current clients? Do you do surveys with people you're currently serving to find out how your work is meeting their needs? Involve is where you work with survivors throughout planning and implementation to consider survivor concerns. Most survivors know, working in the movement, know what it feels like to have someone bring you in to review a project that did not engage a good number of survivors with diverse perspectives in the beginning. And then they're like, hey, what do you think of this? And you're wanting to say, it's garbage, scrap it and start over, but you don't want to say that. So you kind of help them figure out how to make it less garbage. If you get survivors in, even in the planning process, a consulting team working with you, that's involved, and that's going to mean the program turns out better. Collaborate is where you work with survivors on every aspect of program development, implementation, from exploring options to making final decisions. Collaborate might be what we see if we have survivors on staff or people with lived experience as regular contractors, and they're given a part in the, like all people share part in the decision-making. Empower is where survivors have the final decision-making power about what needs to happen, and we're going to implement the strategies they develop. I know that it's not likely to find a nonprofit or an organization where everybody working there is a survivor. But if the organization's top leadership includes a majority of people with lived experience, then we can definitely see that they're probably operating at this empower level. Now, obviously, we want to move up towards increased meaningful survivor engagement, but empower may not be the right level for every project. So, for example, if I'm writing a medical assessment protocol for doctors in the emergency room to assess for a traumatic brain injury, I'm not going to have a group of survivors, if they don't have any medical training, write that protocol, right? So I can't use Empower for that unless I happen to have a handful of survivors who also happen to have specific medical expertise. So I might do Involve for that piece, maybe Collaborate. Typically, Involve and Collaborate are my sweet spot. Collaborate's usually a good sweet spot, but sometimes, depending on capacity, it might be Involved. Again, with a prevention strategy, we can lean more towards Collaborate or Empower. I will say, before coming into prevention work specifically, I didn't realize how much great information there was in the public health field about prevention that could strengthen my prevention work. So I think maybe having some folks with that background, if you don't have survivors who have that background, can be useful. Again, if we're creating a curriculum or training development, we have to ask ourselves a question. Do we have survivor leaders in contact with us who have knowledge about adult learning theory if we're developing a training, or different practices in education if we're writing a curriculum? If you do, then you can shift towards Collaborate and Empower. But again, if you have survivors who have a lot of passion and a lot of lived experience insights about what might work to prevent trafficking, partnering them with people who have specific education methodology expertise can be helpful. So in all of these levels, we have to keep in mind that while we want to move towards a movement that is in that empower with some collaborations level, that it's going to be situation specific, and it's going to depend on the kind of project you're doing. And it's also going to depend on the kinds of people with lived experience you have in your circles, right? There's some logistical limitations sometimes, but you always want to use the highest level that you can while still maintaining the integrity of the work that you're doing. It's a good thing to remember that different projects are going to have different levels that might be right for it. And that, again, is going to depend on the staff that you have available. So maybe one of your departments or one of your projects is at the Involve level, and maybe another department or another project within an organization is at the Empower level. Remember, with all of these, our ultimate goal is to increase the level that we're able to operate at on that spectrum. And one of the ways we can do that is provide really strong professional development to help survivors who don't have those formal credentials learn the basics of some of the different roles they'll be filling. An example of that is The rape crisis center training I went through when I first started as a volunteer at that organization, it was a 63-hour training that gave me a lot of really good skills around active listening, facilitating groups, crisis intervention, all sorts of helpful information. So people don't have to come into your organization and into this work with every single skill that they're going to need to do the job, but you need to have a commitment to supporting them in learning the things they want to learn to do their jobs better. So as it currently stands, a lot of organizations doing anti-trafficking work look a little bit like this, or collaborations may look like this, to where you have a program manager, a researcher, an executive director, healthcare provider, and then you have survivor leaders. This is a survivor leader. This person is not a survivor leader. And this has been useful in a lot of ways because we do want to intentionally bring in people with lived experience. But what this causes sometimes is for the survivor leaders to only be seen as their trauma. You're only seen as bringing the skill of knowing what this feels like to experience it. And a lot of times people who have lived experience who are working as leaders in the field find that even when they're bringing really brilliant ideas to collaborations, that a lot of times those ideas get dismissed because they're assuming you can't have other kinds of expertise because you're a survivor leader. Well, if you think about it, each of these survivor leaders, there's a name for what they're doing, right? They're doing a job beyond just being a survivor. Maybe that survivor leader is an advocate. Maybe that survivor leader is your messaging director. Maybe they're a policy consultant or a trainer or a curriculum developer. And if we can start to see survivors for the work that they're doing in this movement as leaders and for the skills that they bring, and see them as colleagues and as equals and as professionals, then what may start to happen is that some of these other people who might have been afraid to disclose that they also are survivors of trafficking because they didn't want to get crammed into the survivor leader box. And when you create a space where everybody, with or without lived experience of trafficking, is seen for their wisdom and their skills and what they bring, then some of these other people may start to disclose. We're creating a work culture in which some of these other people feel like it's okay for them to acknowledge their lived experience too, in ways they might have been scared to do before. And what you may also start to find is that once we're creating that space where we can bring our whole selves to our work and still be seen as professionals who have skills, then our other people we're working with may bring their whole selves, maybe not lived experience of trafficking, but maybe we discover that that attorney that we've been working with lost a child years ago and knows what trauma and grief feel like and has that sense of connection with us on a human level. And maybe we learn that that healthcare provider is a survivor of partner violence. And while they may not understand the intricacies of trafficking, they may understand very much what it feels like to be trapped in a coercive situation. This gives us a space where we can all start to bring ourselves to the workspace and connect over what we have in common instead of creating the kind of division that makes people feel like they can't disclose if they want to be seen as a professional, and then they have to disclose if they want to have their lived experience respected. So ultimately, our end goal isn't cordoning off survivor leadership into its own little bubble, but empowering all survivors and transforming our movement so that survivors have the supports they need to develop their professional skills. And we also want to transform things so that we have a movement that's thoughtful enough to not chase them off or re-traumatize them. So again, if we go back and think about job titles, and of course in our in-person training, this is a breakout, very interactive job titles. We can go back from trying to think of our survivor leadership job description and think about what survivors can be. Maybe they're a motivational speaker. Maybe they're a curriculum development consultant or a peer mentor or a training consultant. Maybe they're a policy advisor or an activist, right? We can start to see these things and start to see what kinds of skills and expertise that they need to do these roles. So if you're a survivor engaged in the movement, don't undersell your skills, right? I know that for some people, identifying as a survivor leader can be super empowering, but don't ever undersell the skills that you bring into the workspace when you come into them. So again, if we're creating a job description, it can be specific not just to survivor leader, but to the skills they're going to be using in that position. And a lot of times when we write those job descriptions, we think about the required skills that we want them to be able to do, right? So if we think about a peer mentor, right, we don't want to just hire someone because they've been deeply traumatized and be like, congratulations, you're a peer mentor. We want to make sure that there's some skills in place that they can succeed in that work. So, required skills might be compassion, the ability to decenter yourself and recognize that someone else's experiences and needs and hopes may be different from your own. Active listening, so that we can really hold that deep listening space. Trauma-informed care, and not just for the individual, but for things like cultural and historical and intergenerational trauma. And then knowledge of organizational policies on working with clients. So again, if we have a peer mentor, we want them to know and respect our confidentiality, how we do ethical engagement, how to do safety planning, right? Well, anytime you're writing a job description and hoping to fill it with people who have lived experience and have it be more accessible, in addition to your required skills, you might want to start thinking about reframing some of these as a willing to. So let's reframe this. Are these all skills that someone needs to come into the work with? We might be able to divide it this way. Peer mentor, your required skills are compassion and the ability to decenter yourself and your own experiences and needs while you're supporting someone. Willing to learn and practice active listening skills. Willing to learn and practice the principles of trauma-informed care. Willing to learn what cultural and historical and intergenerational trauma are. Willing to learn and implement the organizational policies on how we work with clients. So we've just made this job description more accessible, and we've also just committed ourselves to developing and building up the skills and professional expertise of the people with lived experience that we're hiring. Again, another job survivors might do, curriculum consultant, right? So required skills, knowledge of subject matter in trafficking in both commercial sex and other forms of labor, ability to work collaboratively with the communication or the curriculum team, knowledge of learning theory and how to make an engaging learning experience, familiarity with how to use commenting and suggesting revisions tools in Google Docs. Maybe you're working in a Google Doc. So again, we're looking at this job description and what skills we want. Are there any of these we can make a willing to? Maybe we would frame it like this: knowledge of the subject matter, trafficking, right? Ability to work collaboratively with the team, commitment to creating an engaging learning experience, willing to learn about different types of trafficking in different sectors, learn how to comment and suggest revisions in Google Docs. Maybe you set up a tutorial that you put online to help new hires learn that if they don't have that skill already. Willing to complete basic onboarding, which will include learning theory and tips for making an engaging learning experience. So again, you're seeing that each of these willing to gives your potential new hire an opportunity to make a commitment to building their skills. And it also requires you to make a commitment to developing and building up that person, right? They may not come on the team ready to fly out of the gate with success. So it's a little bit of a slower process, but ultimately it's the kind of process that's going to increase meaningful survivor engagement. So again, we're coming back to there's no such thing as a job description for survivor leader. What do you want the survivor leader to do? What work are you expecting? And remember that survivors in the movement can be specialists. meaning they may have different kinds of movement work that are their jam, that they are very good at. Some may be better trainers and not as well at policy, not as great at policy work. Some may be brilliant at policy and not as great at mentoring, right? So you can't expect any one survivor leader to plug into any role and be successful. Some of us have specialties, things we're better at than others, and we want to put people in the roles that best use their skills and experience and passion. Ultimately, if we're just hiring someone for their trauma history, they're going to be tokenized no matter what. But it is empowering to hire someone for their skills and knowledge. If you hire someone to do something they're not prepared to do and then just dump them there, they're not going to feel empowered. They're going to feel anxious, right? If we hire someone for the skills that they want to be doing and learning and commit to building them up, that's empowering, right? Hiring someone to say what you want them to say, that's tokenizing. That's just where you're using that survivor as a puppet. It is empowering when you hire someone because you want to hear what they have to say and you're committed to listening to what they have to say, even when it's hard. It's tokenizing if you hire someone based on what benefits the organization. It is empowering when you think broadly what benefits the clients we work with and the people impacted. And we're going to hire based on who brings the kind of knowledge that will help us benefit the impacted populations. It's tokenizing to have a diverse workforce and hire people so you can diversify the identities of this people saying the same things you've been saying all along. Like now it's the same thing, but it's a racialized person saying it. Isn't that great? No, that's tokenizing. However, it's empowering if you prioritize diversity in hiring so that you can be open to changing your structure and frameworks and way of doing your work to be more inclusive overall. It's tokenizing to hire someone just to emote. That's performance, right? That's performance. That's not leadership, that's performance. And what happens when people are performing their trauma publicly is we create a dynamic in which, for example, funders hear this story and it's breaking their heart and they're uncomfortable and they're not willing to make meaningful structural change to help that person have a different experience, and people like them have different experiences, but they know I can donate money. And by donating money, I now get to stake my claim in your recovery and your healing. Like I now get to have some kind of ownership over your story because my money helped that happen. The flip side of that is the empowering model in which we hire people to share their wisdom and insight, and we support their continued development as a professional. This is a really hard thing for a lot of anti-trafficking advocates and policymakers and direct service providers to get. But excellence as a provider or policymaker often does not translate into excellence as a colleague. Part of that's because of a lot of our beliefs about trafficking survivors. Even among direct service providers, there may be sort of a hierarchy or a condescension or a paternalism around like, we know what's best for them. They don't know what they need. We have to support them to figure out what they need because they don't know and aren't capable of making their own decisions. But if that's how you view survivors, you're not going to be able to view them as equals, as colleagues, right? So when we think about being a survivor leader in movement spaces, sometimes you feel like you're the marionette, right? They're like, Dan stands for me. And they're kind of like telling you what to do and what to say and how to say it, which can lead to a feeling that you're on a stage or that you're under the microscope. We hear that from survivors a lot about feeling under the microscope. If my colleague who's not out as a survivor of trafficking has a bad day and snaps at someone, they're just having a bad day. But if I have a bad day and snap at someone, it's because I'm too traumatized to do this work, right? Your decisions are scrutinized. The way you show up is scrutinized. If the CEO, the wealthy CEO of a nonprofit shows up wearing designer jeans to a meeting, it's because, you know, they're looking cool and accessible and not stuck on pretense. If the survivor shows up in jeans, then it's probably because they don't realize this is a professional space, right? You're held to different standards. You also end up getting put on a pedestal, right? Because especially if you're going out and sharing your recovery story and you have to show how transformed and recovered and how much better you are. And I was a before picture back then, but now I'm an after picture. And that we forget that that comes with all this pressure to always be an after picture. You get idealized. And then it starts to feel weird because you meet other survivors and they're like, you're so cool. I look up to you so much. And you're like, dude, I am a human, right? So there's a lot of dynamics that are unique to survivors in anti-trafficking spaces. A lot of these, I don't know if you've ever seen this woman of color in the workplace. In the nonprofit organization. It's called the Problem Woman of Color in a Nonprofit. And this framework was developed to refer to what happens when nonprofit organizations adopt a DEI initiative, but aren't committed to doing the work, right? So they end up hiring someone, the woman of color, they're all excited to have her. There's a honeymoon period. Everybody's so excited to have her there and wants to make her feel welcome. She's excited because she's feeling the love. But ultimately, if she's a tokenized hire, she starts to notice the reality. You know, the longer she's there, the more she's like, this is not the honeymoon. This is a little weird. Like, guys, have you noticed that this is wrong in the organization? And she tries really hard to work within the organization structure and policies and pushes for accountability while experiencing repetitive microaggressions and being dismissed and sort of being shut down in subtle and kind of gaslighting ways. And eventually she kind of like calls it out and is like, this is not okay. This is racism. Like, this is coded racism and sometimes not so coded. And then the organization's response is to deny it. This is not about race. This is about culture fit. This is about professionalism, right? And you should fix the problem by changing your behavior. You also find in these situations that people of color get sort of pitted against each other within the organization. And then she ends up experiencing retaliation after a period of time. The organization treats her as if she's the problem. You're the problem. This is not about us. This is about challenges that you're having. Clearly, you don't fit in here. They end up calling it like a communication issue or whatever, and then she leaves. And so while this was developed to be a framework to highlight how racism plays out in the workplace, we can recognize that a lot of these dynamics happen when an organization hires survivors to work in the workplace. And after going through this process, this very similar cycle with survivors in the workplace, sometimes they start to have like I don't know if survivors are really fit to be doing this professional work, when they never really listened to the survivor and adapted their protocols and policies accordingly, and when they didn't really build the survivor up to be successful in the first place. If we want to have good relationships with survivors of trafficking as our colleagues, this requires having some professional and personal humility about lived experience, meaning you need to have some humility about how much your lived experience counts for what you know and what you don't know, right? Just because you've done a ton of research on trafficking doesn't mean you know everything about what it's like to live in that experience. And I will say some of that humility can help for colleague relationships between survivors in the movement as well, because your lived experience, I mean, we know the definition of trafficking is so broad. There are as many ways to experience trafficking as there are survivors, right? They're not all the same. We're not a monolith. So you'll need to have some humility about how you know what you know, but that doesn't mean you know everything. You need to have some humility as a professional about other people's experiences of your profession and of professional services. So if you're in law enforcement and someone is anxious and you're like, but I'm a cop, I'm here to keep you safe. Why do you not trust me? You need to check yourself, because a lot of survivors have had frightening, traumatic, or harmful and violent experiences. Even with social workers, it's important to remember that people may have had negative experiences with social workers, with law enforcement, with public health professionals, with case managers, with crisis responders, with lawyers. And if they come in and aren't immediately trusting you, instead of getting grumpy and deciding that this survivor that you're talking to just doesn't understand or respect your work, maybe you should check yourself and realize this person may have had experiences that led them to have this impression. It didn't just come out of nowhere. And then you're going to want to have professional and personal humility about all the other identities that we all hold, because people come in with, maybe you don't have lived experience, but you are LGBTQ, right? And so you have some feeling of what it feels like to be marginalized or oppressed or excluded. And also, that's not a direct parallel for the identities and experiences that the people you're working with may have had. So we don't want to assume that just because we understand some form of oppression or trauma, that we necessarily understand everyone else's backgrounds. And I would say, again, that's valuable between survivors as well. And survivors sometimes need to have professional and personal humility between themselves and colleagues. So, for example, a white cisgender survivor may lack some of the insights that someone who is a queer or trans, Black or Indigenous person who maybe is not a survivor of trafficking, that person may have insights about how racism impacts communities that white cisgender survivor may not have. We also want to remember that the presence of survivor leaders does not automatically equal trauma-informed. I know I catch heat for this when I say this sometimes, but survivors don't get halos just because we've been traumatized, right? We can still make mistakes. We can still cause harm. We can still, our ego can still get in the way. We can still have gaps in our knowledge and professional experience. What we want to do, instead of just having survivor leaders and now we've done our work, is think about how do we create trauma-informed organizations? And again, anytime we say trauma-informed, remember cultural, historical, and intergenerational trauma as well. So you'll want to spend some time within your organization reflecting on what makes a trauma-informed organization. How do we put that into practice? It's great to talk about your values around trauma-informed, but how do you respond to emails? How do you supervise your employees? How do your policies and human resources approaches reflect that commitment in action? And then I want you to think with your organization, this can be an ongoing process within your organization. When we think about what it looks like in practice, there's the ideal and there's the reality. And sometimes the reality is that it's not as easy to implement these as just going out and implementing it. Sometimes we need to think about what are these challenges and how can we overcome them? And you may need to get strategic about overcoming the barriers to a trauma-informed organization. So no organization is ever going to be completely ready and have it all done. And if you wait, it's kind of like having a kid. If you wait until you've got everything lined up and are ready, and you're never going to have one. So it's the same with this. You don't have to wait until your organization is like a shining, glowing example of being survivor informed and survivor centered before you hire survivors, but you want to be conscious that sometimes there's some things you can do to make it a better workplace, right? Determine your why. Why do you want to hire survivors? Why are you making it a priority to increase survivor engagement and leadership in your organization? Is it so you can check the box and brag that you're survivor informed? Or is it because you deeply recognize that survivor expertise in your organization means your work is going to be more effective, that your work is going to provide greater benefit to people that you're serving? And then outline your values. Define what you think of as success. What do we think of as success? Does success mean we hired survivors and we have a number of survivors, a percentage of our staff are survivors? Or do we define success as our employees with lived experience, when they complete surveys about their experience as employees, provide answers that are similar to our other employees? If you're assessing job satisfaction among your staff and your people with lived experience on staff routinely rate lower numbers than your other staff, you're having a hard time with that. That's something to notice, right? If you have a certain percentage of survivor staff, but none of them are in supervisor, middle management, or executive positions, that's something to notice. Why is that? How can you build people up? Do any of your current staff want to move into those leadership and management roles? And if so, how can you help them get there? You want to build in feedback mechanisms for navigating harm. Do not assume that you're going to hire survivors and they're going to be so excited to have a job that their first day on the job and second and third, you're just going to hold hands at every staff meeting and sing camp songs together and it's going to be beautiful. Go ahead and assume you're going to mess some stuff up, right? In spite of your best intentions, you're going to mess stuff up with most of your employees, but definitely with some of them who are survivors. And so you want to go ahead and plan for how you're going to respond to that with integrity, with intention, and in alignment with your values. You're going to want to plan for vicarious trauma and organizational health. This work can be hard, not just for the survivors of trafficking, but we know that not very many people go into helping professions without having had some sort of lived experience that makes them think it's important, right? You come into helping professions because you probably got something in your past you're working out. Hopefully, you're also working it out with your therapist and not just in your workplace. But because of that, that means that some of what we experience every day can be kind of traumatic. The stories we're hearing, the weights that we're carrying. And it can be especially hard for those who have lived experience. So we want to make sure we're building in organizational wellness. We're building in things to distract or push back against a culture of overwork. We're going to want to build in debriefs where people can debrief not just about the logistics of a situation, but about what parts of it were hard for them to hold. And you're also going to want to, in order for organizational readiness to be legit, you're going to want to commit to an ongoing diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice framework, right? You're going to want to make sure that you are doing right by people who've typically been marginalized from access to your leadership positions in your organizations. That's essential for a variety of reasons, but also because we want to create a space that's safer and more emergent and braver for all survivors, and not just the ones who look like the people we've typically had in leadership. So a few things that'll get in your way. Power. Nobody likes to let go of power. And I will say, even among survivors, sometimes with survivors, once you finally start to get some power, you don't want to let it go because you know what it feels like to be without power. And you want to hold on to that power. And it's especially common among people who don't have that lived experience because they're just used to having the power and the decision making. And so we want to create models for shared power. How are we intentional about our power sharing to make sure that people have a voice in decisions that are made about the work? Our ego will get in the way because part of being a good colleague to people with lived experience is being able to hear feedback that what you're doing may not be great, right? That's hard. Nobody, and I know it sounds like we may be picking on people without lived experience on this one, but nobody likes hearing that what you tried really hard to do well did not go over as well. Nobody likes hearing that your passionate attempts to change the world and transform things and do good and support people ended up causing them harm. That's really, really hard. And it's really hard when you're scared of the consequences or of losing support. And that can lead people to not want to admit that they've made mistakes, which is where we start to see that fragility come in, right? I know that white fragility is a term that we use in racial equity spaces, but I feel like sometimes there can be a little bit of an ally fragility to where there's like, oh, but I tried so hard. It's really hard to hear that feedback. And also, I can give someone feedback that something they did caused me harm without thinking they're a bad person, without hating them, without wanting to take them down. We need to figure out ways to give and receive that feedback without ego, power, and fragility getting in the way. That might be an intentional process in your organization. If you want to be a welcoming place for survivors as colleagues, you need to think about how you're going to navigate power differentials between professionals who have lived experience and those who don't, right? Especially if that professional without lived experience has at some point had a client-provider relationship with those survivor leaders they're now working with. We can't pretend like the power dynamic doesn't exist. That's how we get ourselves into trouble, is being like, we're all equals here, without acknowledging there's an inherent power differential. So we want to acknowledge it and plan for how we're going to navigate it. That may mean that you have to set the stage, and like build the container for the conversation you want to have so that they know that that feedback is welcomed. You may want to think about how to navigate power differentials between professionals who are both survivors, but maybe have different positions in the movement or agency. So an example of that might mean, what if you have one person with lived experience who's in senior management and another person with lived experience who is a shelter staff? Those people may both have powerful insight, but if we sit them both down at the same table and it's like, hey, we're both survivors and total equals, we're failing to notice the ways that those people may receive different levels of respect and feedback in the organization, right? You want to think about professionals with lived experience may have different levels of power in the movement. A lot of times, again, survivors may be so used to understanding their story in terms of marginalization or lack of power that they may not notice that slide as they start to become more sought after in the movement, as they start to move up professional leadership positions. And so they may not realize that when they smack down that new survivor leader or criticize or manipulate that new survivor leader, that's abuse of power. Even if you're a survivor of trafficking, you can abuse power within the movement. So we want to be conscious, again, instead of pretending like these will never happen in our rainbow world. We want to be like, this may happen. How are we going to navigate it? How are we going to try to prevent it? And then again, between professionals who have different perspectives from the mainstream, right? So those professionals with or without lived experience who largely agree with mainstream anti-trafficking norms tend to have more power in some decision-making and policy spaces than those that don't. That's a power dynamic we want to be conscious of. Some ways we can navigate these power differentials is just to acknowledge them. I don't think you can do any meaningful survivor engagement without first acknowledging that this movement, it has a history of harm against survivors. That may be identity-based harm, that they could be experience or access-based harm, identity or experience or access-based power dynamics. We want to learn what accountability means. What does it really mean to be accountable? What do the people we're working with who have been harmed need to feel like there's been accountability? You're going to want to have clear roles and responsibilities so that we don't just assume our power gives us a role that maybe wasn't part of our original role. And then we want to really respect boundaries and have realistic expectations about the work, about the power dynamics, about how we navigate boundaries. Ultimately, if we want to create a survivor-informed movement with meaningful survivor engagement, we have to do the work to create an empowering environment for survivors to work in, which gives them the ability to show up in this work as their full selves. That's our ultimate goal. You shouldn't have to decide, am I wearing my lived experience hat or my professional hat? Because that then keeps you from tapping into the full breadth of your knowledge, right? That means that at any given time, if you're only a professional or only a survivor, then you have knowledge and skills and insights that you're not able to bring to that space. What we want to do is create the environment where survivors can show up as their full selves professionally. Some ways we can do this. If we think in practice, about what informed means. That's where we're talking about fact sheets, newsletters that have accessible language, doing focused outreach to let people know about the work that you're doing. Consult is going to mean survivor surveys, specifically with those clients you're already working with the intention of incorporating the feedback into policies and practices. We don't conduct surveys so that they can give us a 5-star on everything and we can pat ourselves on the back. We conduct surveys so that we can learn how we can better meet their needs. Involve might look like having survivor consultants. Involve might look like doing focus groups to make sure you know, and if you do the focus groups, you want to do them at different stages in the process, including development and planning. Collaborate might look like having a long-term survivor advisory board that has actual decision-making power, or having staff or staff members or regular contractors who have lived experience. And empower is where we're looking at staff or regular contractors who have lived experience in leadership and decision-making positions. We have those lived experience staff in leadership and decision-making positions, not just hired as staff. Organizations should aim to incorporate several structures. So by structures, we mean out of these different structures. You'll want to do several of those comprehensively at once as appropriate and effective. Put your feedback mechanisms in place before you start recruiting for survivor leaders. You want to find the balance between recruiting those who align with your existing organizational values and seeking a diversity of experience and opinion. The more diversity and experience and opinion we bring to the table, the more we can develop bigger, broader solutions that meet the needs of a higher number of people. You're going to want to determine if it's necessary to require that these roles are publicly labeled as lived experience or survivor roles, because some people may not apply who have lived experience if they worry that taking that role is going to out them, right? So decide what you need. Maybe you can say something like, we recognize that people with lived experience who would be wonderful for this job may be hesitant to apply if they don't meet all the requirements. And we encourage passionate individuals to apply if you have lived experience, whether or not you meet all the criteria or not, because even if you don't fit this role, there may be another one we can hire you for. Put something like that in your job description. And then most organizations, I would say almost all, should pay survivor leaders for their involvement in labor. And the reason that I say most instead of all is because I have seen organizations exclude survivors from volunteer positions because we don't have the budget to pay you. So an example of that is at the Rape Crisis Center I started my work at, the hotline volunteers. It was an all volunteer position, right? It was just their norm that this is a standard volunteer position that people can fill and apply to be a volunteer with the org. If I had applied for that and they had said, oh, we can't accept you into the program because this is a volunteer position and you have lived experience, and I had argued and that had still been the end of it, that would have been denying my agency, right? So at the same time that we need to normalize paying survivors for their skills, for their work, for the times that they share their stories with your organization, for any feedback they give you, at the same time, we want to recognize survivor agency. And so that's super important. Ultimately, what it comes down to is a sector is led by professionals. A movement is led by impacted people. And anyone working as a professional in this movement who does not have lived experience, as professional and passionate and engaged as they are, they're still an ally, right? They still need to be conscious of what an ally's role is. And an ally's role is not saving. An ally's role is not rescuing. An ally's role is not fixing. An ally's role is solidarity. And I'm going to stop our recording. Thanks for joining us.